Now let's move on to ferns. I have a few pictures of some ferns I thought were really pretty. There's this leatherleaf fern, sword fern, a simple ruffled leaf fern, and then maidenhair fern. I'm going to start with the sword fern. I'll start by painting the stem down the center. I'm going to curve the stem ever so slightly to help it feel a little more realistic. Now I'm adding in the leaves. These are single blade leaf strokes, and toward the top the leaves are a little more crowded, so I'm overlapping them just a little bit. I'm not angling these individual leaves as much as I did with the evergreen because they do point a little more outward, perpendicular to the stem. I'm also keeping all of the leaves pretty close to the same in length, but varying the widths just slightly as I move my way down. You'll also notice I'm not keeping every leaf perfectly the same size because that's not how they look in the reference photo. I'm not painting every individual leaf I see in the photo, but if you were to look at this painting, you could probably guess what it was, and that's what we're going for. Next, I'm going to paint this leatherleaf fern. I'm going to start the same way I started my sword fern by painting the stem and a few of these small leaves right here at the top, but then I'm going to paint these individual stems and mini leaves to recreate the feel of leather leaf. I'm keeping everything pretty small and tight here toward the top, and then as I go down, the stems are a little more spread out, and the individual leaves are a tiny bit bigger. I'm angling these tiny leaves just like we did with the evergreen, but I'm making a smaller stroke to create this shape rather than flicking my wrist. With these last couple of rows, I kept the stems a little bit shorter so that the fern kind of curved back in and it didn't just get wider and wider at the bottom. I want to leave a little bit of a stem here at the bottom, so that looks pretty good. Next, let's paint the simple fern. I've painted the stem, and now I'm adding in these ruffled leaves. To create the ruffle, I'm painting the leaves exactly as I did in the leatherleaf fern, but rather than space out my tiny leaves, I'm overlapping my strokes so that my leaf looks ruffled. I'm just going to paint these all the way down my stem. And now when I get toward the bottom of my individual leaf, I'm making sure to curve the last strokes just a little bit at the bottom so that the leaves look rounded. You'll want to work pretty quickly with these so that your paint will blend together. You can see with this leaf, I wasn't afraid to just overlap these two leaves, and it worked because my paint wasn't dry yet, so those can bleed together. I'll help define those individual leaves later when I add details. Last, let's paint the maidenhair fern. I'm not going to paint this entire thing, but rather just focus on one of the stems. I think a lot of students get hung up with feeling like they have to paint every detail from a reference photo, but that's really just not the case. You can capture the shape, color, texture. It can be one element or all the elements from whatever you're looking at. Now, for this maidenhair fern, the leaves are ruffled and heart-shaped. These first few, until about halfway down the stem, I'm just connecting the leaves to the main stem, before adding more stems and leaves outward. To add a little bit of interest, I just changed up the green ever so slightly as I went along. Now let's go back and add a little bit of detail to our ruffled leaf fern. I'm using my size 0 round brush and adding in detail the same way I've done to the other leaves. I'm keeping the vein lines angled. You'll notice I skipped that second leaf. It's because it wasn't fully dry yet, and I didn't want my detail lines to just bleed back into the leaf. You can also see that there isn't a high contrast in the leaves versus the veins. You could definitely paint the veins with something darker to up the contrast, but I just wanted to keep this one subtle.